In the early 13th century, as the Mongol Empire expanded westward under the command of generals like Subutai, their armies moved with unmatched speed across vast lands. They were not just conquerors, but masters of coordination, intelligence, and psychological warfare. Wherever they went, news of their arrival spread fear long before their armies were seen. Far to the northwest, in the colder regions near the edges of Scandinavia and the Baltic, small Norse settlements still existed. These were not the great Viking armies of earlier centuries, but smaller groups of hardened warriors who had survived through raiding, trading, and constant conflict. They were experienced fighters, used to harsh winters and brutal combat. One such group, numbering close to 100 men, had gathered near a narrow stretch of land between forest and frozen marsh. Their leader was not a king, but a seasoned warrior, someone chosen through respect rather than title. These men were not expecting to face an empire. At most, they anticipated local conflicts or small raids. The first sign of danger did not come from sight, but from silence. Birds had stopped moving. The wind carried a strange stillness. Scouts sent ahead did not return. And then, faintly at first, came the distant vibration of movement. Steady, rhythmic, unnatural. When the Vikings finally saw them, it was already too late to withdraw. On the horizon, a wide formation of mounted riders stretched across the land. It was not a raiding party. It was not even a standard war band. It was a segment of a much larger Mongol force, likely part of a scouting or forward detachment, but still numbering in the thousands. The Vikings understood immediately. They were outnumbered beyond reason. Retreat was difficult. The terrain behind them was slow and dangerous, filled with marshy ground and dense forest. The Mongols, with their horses and mobility, would easily overtake them in open pursuit. So the decision was made quickly and without debate. They would hold their ground. The Vikings moved toward a slightly elevated patch of firm land, where the marsh narrowed movement and the forest limited flanking attacks. It was not a perfect position, but it was the best available. Shields were raised, lines were formed, weapons were checked in silence. Across the field, the Mongols did not rush. They observed. Messengers moved between units. Riders spread out, forming a loose arc around the Viking position. This was standard Mongol behavior. They studied first, attacked later. They wanted to understand the enemy before committing fully. The Vikings, unfamiliar with such tactics, waited. Time passed slowly. The cold air made every breath visible. The tension grew heavier with each moment. No one spoke much. There was no need. Every man there understood what was coming. Eventually, the first movement began. A group of Mongol riders advanced within range, not charging, but positioning themselves carefully. Bows were raised, not in haste, but with practiced calm. The Vikings tightened their formation. Then, without warning, the first volley of arrows was released. The arrows came fast and in large numbers. Unlike many European forces of the time, the Mongols specialized in mounted archery. Their bows were powerful, and their accuracy remained high, even while moving. The Viking shield wall absorbed the initial attack. Arrows struck wood and iron, embedding deeply or glancing off at sharp angles. The formation held, but the impact was significant. Arms strained under repeated hits, and the sound of arrows striking shields echoed continuously. The Mongols did not stop. They moved in cycles. One group would approach, release arrows, and withdraw. Another would take its place from a different angle. This constant rotation ensured that pressure never dropped. The Vikings were forced to remain alert at all times, unable to rest or reposition. Minutes turned into hours. Slowly, the effectiveness of the shield wall began to decrease. Some shields cracked, others became too heavy with embedded arrows. A few warriors were struck in exposed areas: legs, shoulders, necks. Each loss weakened the formation further. Despite this, the Vikings did not break formation easily. They were trained for close combat, not this kind of distant harassment. Still, discipline kept them together. Whenever Mongol riders came too close, a few Vikings would surge forward briefly, forcing them to retreat. The Mongols observed this as well. They avoided direct engagement unless necessary. Their goal was not to rush into unnecessary losses, but to reduce the enemy's strength gradually. At some point, the situation shifted. The Viking formation had shrunk. Gaps had appeared. Coordination was becoming harder. Fatigue was visible. Not just physical, but mental. The Mongol commanders recognized this moment. Signals were given. The pattern of attack changed. Instead of continuous circling, multiple units began to converge more aggressively. Arrows still came, but now there was movement toward closer engagement. The distance between the two forces began to close. For the Vikings, this was both a danger and an opportunity. Close combat was where they were strongest. As the first Mongol riders approached within striking distance, the Vikings pushed forward in controlled bursts. Axes and spears found their marks. A few riders were pulled from their horses. For brief moments, the Vikings regained some control of the situation. But these moments did not last. Every advance exposed them to more arrows from other directions. Every success came with additional losses. The Mongols adapted quickly, pulling back when needed and pressing forward elsewhere. The battlefield became chaotic. The original formation was no longer intact. Small groups of Vikings fought independently now, surrounded on multiple sides. Coordination had broken down into localized survival. The Mongols, however, maintained structure. Their units continued to communicate, reposition, and attack in organized waves. Even in closer range, they retained the advantage of numbers and flexibility. By this stage, the outcome was becoming clear. As the battle continued, the number of surviving Vikings decreased steadily. What had begun as a unified group of 100 was now reduced to scattered fighters, each engaged in separate struggles across the frozen ground. The Mongols tightened their control over the field. They no longer needed to rely only on arrows. With the Viking resistance weakened, more units moved in for direct engagement. Small groups of cavalry closed the distance carefully, surrounding isolated fighters and cutting them down one by one. The coordination of the Mongol army remained intact, even in the final phase of the battle. The Vikings, however, were no longer fighting as a formation. They fought as individuals now. Each man relied on his own strength, his own experience, and whatever energy he had left. Some stood their ground, refusing to step back even when surrounded. Others moved constantly, trying to avoid being encircled for as long as possible. The cold air carried the sound of metal striking metal, mixed with the heavy breathing of exhausted men. Snow beneath their feet had turned dark and uneven, disturbed by hours of movement and conflict. As time passed, resistance slowed, not suddenly, but gradually. Fewer movements, longer pauses between clashes, more gaps of silence. The remaining Vikings were no longer able to push forward or regroup. They could only react, defend, and delay what was becoming inevitable. One by one, they fell. Some were struck down from a distance before they could reach their attackers. Others were surrounded by multiple riders and overwhelmed despite putting up strong resistance. A few managed to hold their ground longer than expected, forcing the Mongols to spend more time and effort than anticipated. Eventually, only a very small number remained. At that stage, the battle was no longer about tactics or positioning. It had become a matter of endurance. How long a single individual could continue under impossible conditions. The Mongols advanced carefully, avoiding unnecessary risk even now. They had seen enough resistance to remain cautious. And then, finally, the last of the Viking fighters were brought down. The movement on the battlefield began to slow. Weapons lowered, horses were steadied. Orders were passed more quietly now. The noise of battle faded into a heavy stillness. What remained was the aftermath. The Mongol forces moved across the field, checking for survivors, gathering their units, and reorganizing after the engagement. For them, this was one part of a much larger campaign. There were more objectives ahead, more territory to cover, more battles to fight. But even within that routine, the cost of the encounter was visible, not in terms of defeat, but in effort. The Vikings had not changed the outcome. The result had never truly been in doubt. But they had forced the Mongols to commit time, attention, and resources to a situation that, at first glance, seemed insignificant. And that mattered in a different way. Encounters like this were rarely recorded in detail, especially when they involved small groups rather than major armies. Yet they reflect something important about the nature of warfare in that period. It was not always the largest battles that defined an era, but also the countless smaller clashes that occurred on the edges of expanding empires. For the Mongols, this engagement reinforced the effectiveness of their system, mobility, discipline, and coordination. These elements allowed them to face unfamiliar enemies and still maintain control of the battlefield. For the Vikings, it represented the final stage of a long tradition of warfare that had once dominated Northern Europe. Their methods, close combat, shield formations, individual strength, were still formidable, but no longer enough against armies built around speed and distance. The battlefield itself returned to silence. Wind moved again across the open land. Snow began to settle over the marks of conflict, slowly covering what had taken place. In time, there would be no visible sign of the encounter, no clear boundary, no lasting structure, only the land, and whatever memory remained among those who had passed through it. And that is often how history works. Not every fight becomes a recorded event. Not every group is remembered by name, but each encounter, no matter how small, is part of a larger story of how different peoples met, fought, and adapted to one another. In this case, the outcome was clear, but the significance was quieter. It was a moment where two very different ways of war briefly met, and one proved more suited to the changing world.